A winter wind rolled across the town of Dry Creek, carrying dust instead of snow and rattling the loose boards on the old wooden church. Lantern light glowed through frosted window panes, casting warm halos upon the frozen ground. Ethel Whitfield stood outside for a moment, clutching a basket of cornbread wrapped in flannel, gathering her courage the way some women gathered shawls. She had dressed with care, choosing a modest blue gown she had mended by lamplight the night before, smoothing its seams as if the needle itself could steady her resolve. Tonight was the annual Christmas feast, and the entire settlement would gather beneath the church rafters, plates heavy with roasted venison, baked apples, and steaming cider. Ethel reminded herself she was a schoolteacher, a woman with purpose, and she would hold her head high even if her heart felt thin as worn linen. She entered through the side door, where the scent of cinnamon and pine sap wrapped around her like a familiar memory. The room was alive with soft chatter, clinking dishes, and the rustle of ribbons tied to every beam. Families settled around long wooden tables draped with homespun cloth, the benches full of wives leaning into husbands, children tugging on sleeves, and neighbors greeting one another like kin. Ethel helped arrange pies and polish spoons for the younger girls preparing cider, smiling gently whenever a child asked her to fix a crooked bow or straighten a crooked ponytail. She carried herself with quiet grace, offering help without asking for acknowledgement. She should have been used to being alone, yet gatherings always tugged at the sore places she tried to hide. Last spring she had let herself believe Samuel Burke might walk beside her, perhaps even ask for a future they could build from faith and shared days. He had been kind when she first arrived, showing her which wells were safe and helping mend the school fence after a storm. He rode a handsome chestnut mare and could make a room laugh without trying, and she had felt a soft warmth whenever he lingered to hear her speak. Those early evenings had glowed in her imagination like candles in the dark. Samuel had seemed to admire her steady ways, praising her reading lessons and calling her voice a gift for lonely children. But admiration was not affection, and affection without courage turns brittle. Over the summer his visits became fewer, and by autumn she sensed he was stepping back, unsure of what a teacher could offer a ranch hand whose friends expected a different match. She had accepted it quietly, telling herself loneliness was easier than clinging to hopes that never bloomed. Tonight she wished she were fully healed, yet hearts do not mend on command. As Ethel stood near the supper table, smoothing a wrinkle in the cloth, the doors swung open with a gust of cold air. Samuel walked in with a young shop girl wrapped in polished curls, her gloved hand tucked confidently into his arm. They made a handsome pair, she in a new maroon dress with lace cuffs, he in a fresh vest and polished boots. Samuel nodded politely toward Ethel, the greeting so brief it felt like a passing shadow rather than a memory shared between two people. The shopgirl did not notice Ethel at all, which hurt less than Samuel pretending not to see the years of unspoken tenderness Ethel had once believed might matter. Ethel stepped back from the tables as if giving space to a world that no longer belonged to her. She chose the last bench near the shuttered window, where candlelight did not fully reach, and served herself a ladle of stew. She ate slowly, letting the warmth settle against the ache she kept carefully hidden. Around her, laughter rose and fell like music she could hear but not join. She watched fathers lifting sleepy toddlers, mothers tucking shawls around fidgeting sons, and young couples whispering with faces glowing from lanterns. The beauty of it was undeniable, yet it pressed on her like a reminder that she remained outside the circle. Two matrons seated near the front whispered, while peering over their hymn sheets. Ethel caught only pieces, but the sharpness was unmistakable. One murmured that Samuel deserved a wife who understood cattle life and supper chores, not a teacher with more books than practical sense. The other suggested Ethel's refinement made men uneasy, as if she seemed too lofty for the rough rhythm of frontier marriage. Ethel lifted her spoon again, steadying her breath. She refused to feed bitterness, even when unkindness arrived without invitation. Children ran past her, boots tapping against the floorboards, cheeks flushed from excitement. Ethel smiled for them, humming a carol under her breath, letting the familiar notes shield her from the sting of whispered opinions. She remembered why she taught. For the lonely, the restless, the ones who needed someone to see them without judgment. Across the hall, Samuel laughed as the shopgirl told a playful story, leaning closer to her with clear adoration. Ethel watched for a moment before shifting her gaze to the window. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters, carrying the scent of sage and distant mesquite fires. The world beyond the room felt wide and forgiving, not demanding explanations or proof of belonging. She straightened the edge of her skirt and reminded herself she was still grateful to be invited, still grateful to serve the town's children, still grateful for the chance to witness joy, even if none of it touched her directly. Yet gratitude did not erase the quiet longing to be welcomed as more than a teacher. She longed to rest her head against someone who wanted her presence as much as she wanted theirs. When the candles flickered from a draught, Ethel looked toward the far end of the hall and sensed the air change. The door had opened again, and every conversation softened. A tall figure stepped into the church hall, and the door shut behind him with the slow certainty of a final chord. Every lantern flame seemed to pause, their light bending toward him, as if acknowledging a presence too large to ignore. He was an Apache named Nayati, known in whispered fragments across Dry Creek, though few had spoken to him long enough to understand the quietness that lived within his eyes. He wore a woven poncho draped loosely over his broad, shirtless chest, the fabric patterned with earth tones that seemed to rise from the desert itself. His hair hung to the middle of his back in a single dark braid, weighted with a few rough beads that caught the lantern glow like forgotten embers. He carried no rifle and no blade, only the balanced stillness of a man who did not fear the silence around him. Conversations tapered, not with hostility, but with the instinctive stillness that arises when the unknown enters a space where comfort has already settled. Men stiffened slightly without knowing why. Mothers guided their children closer with protective hands. Samuel Burke paused in the middle of passing cider to the shopgirl, his smile faltering as Nayati's silhouette filled the entrance like a shadow sculpted from the land itself. Even the sheriff felt the moment stretch, though he greeted the newcomer with a respectful nod, aware that Nayati had helped the town track wounded livestock, return stray horses, and mend fences that had buckled under monsoon winds. Ethel, still seated along the last bench, lifted her gaze with a calm curiosity rather than alarm. She had heard murmurs about a man who could follow hoofprints across rocky ridges, as if reading scripture written into the earth. She knew that some settlers distrusted his presence, as if peace became confusing when it came from a man whose ancestors once stood defiantly against the government. Yet she sensed no threat in the way he moved. Nayati's posture carried dignity instead of defiance, as if he walked into the feast not to be welcomed, but simply to witness. He stepped forward without hurry, feet silent on the creaking wood. The cold seemed to trail in behind him, settling briefly before the firelight warmed the space once more. Nayati took in the scene with thoughtful eyes. The families, the decorations made of pine and cloth scraps, the abundance of food, the mingled scents of venison and apples and sweet bread. Nothing in his gaze betrayed longing or resentment. He observed without measuring, without asking for room. One young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering questions she did not answer. The mother simply guided the child's attention back to the hymn sheets, her hand trembling slightly, though she forced a polite smile. Nayati inclined his head gently toward her, not offended by caution, just acknowledging it as part of living among settlers who did not yet understand him. The sheriff invited him to take a plate, though the sheriff's wife forced her smile like she wished the moment would pass quickly. Nayati did not step forward to serve himself. Instead, he chose a narrow bench near the door, a place where shadows softened the lantern's glow. He sat with shoulders relaxed and hands open upon his knees, looking more like a guardian than a guest. No one joined him at the table, though several eyes watched from afar, unsure whether they should fear or admire. Ethel's attention lingered longer than anyone else's. Perhaps she recognized loneliness so instinctively that she could feel it even across the room. She noticed that no one set a plate before him, though the feast had more than enough to feed every inhabitant twice over. The abundance did not reach him, not because food was scarce, but because welcome was selective. She sat very still, absorbing the contradiction that a celebration for every soul did not seem to include the man nearest the door. A soft ache rose inside her, familiar yet sharper tonight. It was one thing to feel invisible among people who had known her for a year, and another to witness a man rendered invisible before speaking a single word. Ethel watched Nayati lower his gaze toward the wooden floor, not with shame, but with an understanding older than any of the hymns sung in the room. She rose quietly, lifting a second plate from the stack and filling it with venison, steamed potatoes, slices of bread spread with honey, and a ladle of stew fragrant with rosemary. Her movements were careful so she would not draw attention. Kindness was not meant to embarrass anyone. She crossed the hall with an ease that surprised even her, as if her feet already understood where she belonged. When she reached Nayati's table, she placed the plate before him and set a tin cup of cider beside it. Nayati looked up slowly, meeting her eyes. The lantern light caught a calm intelligence in his features, a softness that felt unexpected given his towering frame. Ethel waited for him to speak, noticing that her hands had started to tremble from nerves she could not identify. Nayati inclined his head once, a gesture more meaningful than spoken gratitude. The simplicity of it warmed something inside her, as if the space between them no longer held the same tension it had held moments before. Ethel returned to her seat, though she felt Samuel watching her from across the tables. His expression held a flicker of discomfort, perhaps because generosity challenged the comfortable story he liked to tell about her being fragile or impractical. Ethel folded her hands and looked toward the musicians preparing to play carols, trying to steady the quiet rhythm of her breath. For the first time tonight, she did not feel entirely alone. Nayati ate with patient movements, tasting each bite as though he understood the hours that went into preparing a meal for a town. He paused periodically to watch families laughing, children falling over one another in their excitement, elders discussing winter grazing. His eyes carried neither hunger nor resentment, only reflection, as though the hall gave him something to study rather than something to desire. Ethel found herself wondering who Nayati had been before arriving in Dry Creek, whether he carried stories no one cared enough to ask, and whether his solitude was chosen or inherited. She wondered if the silence that surrounded him was painful or peaceful. When she dared another glance, Nayati was already watching her, not intrusively, but with the same curiosity she felt toward him. Their eyes met briefly, and Ethel felt a sudden, inexplicable certainty that this night would not end the same way it had begun. Laughter rose and fell like waves across the hall as carols drifted through the warm air. Yet Ethel felt every note sharpen her solitude. She stood to refill the cider pitcher when two women near the pastry table leaned toward one another with voices soft but pointed. Ethel did not mean to overhear, yet loneliness sharpens the senses the way darkness sharpens starlight. One woman murmured that Samuel Burke had made a good decision tonight, choosing a young lady more suited to a rancher's life. The other whispered that Ethel spent too much time with books and lonely widows, as if she cared more about teaching than preparing for marriage. Their words floated toward Ethel like slow-burning embers, landing without permission and leaving heat beneath her ribs. Ethel lifted the pitcher carefully, steadying her hands before anyone could see them tremble. She tried not to resent the women, for gossip often came from boredom rather than malice, yet it still wounded her pride. She reminded herself that she had not come here to be admired, only to celebrate Christmas with the children she taught and the neighbors she tried to serve. Still, she wished the night could end before it frayed the edges of her resolve. Samuel approached her near the lampstand with a practiced smile. His posture held the confidence of a man who expected cordiality even when kindness cost nothing. Ethel offered him polite greeting, her voice steady though her heart felt bruised. Samuel complimented her cinnamon pies before glancing over his shoulder, to ensure the shopgirl was occupied with conversation elsewhere. His tone shifted, suddenly hushed and burdened with certainty. He told Ethel he had always respected her, but he hoped she would not cling to the idea that he owed her affection. He spoke as though her feelings were burdens he had kindly set aside. Ethel met his gaze without shrinking, though she felt her breath tighten. She thanked him for speaking plainly, though every syllable seemed to echo against something fragile inside her. Samuel continued, explaining that she needed a different kind of man. Someone quiet, scholarly, perhaps suited for a teacher's life rather than the dust and demands of ranching. He said it gently, yet his words dismissed her heart as if it were a miscalculation rather than a living thing. Ethel responded with grace, telling him she wished him happiness. Samuel looked relieved, as though he had escaped a responsibility he feared would linger. He returned to the shopgirl, who laughed with relief when he took her hand as if sealing a victory. Ethel set down the cider pitcher and inhaled slowly, trying to absorb the sharp sting of rejection without letting it crack her composure. Her eyes drifted toward the window where the lantern glow softened against the night, and she whispered silently for the strength to endure a room full of joy without letting sorrow steal her breath. From across the hall, Nayati watched the exchange unfold. His expression hardly changed, yet his jaw tightened with a quiet understanding that did not require words. He had witnessed men speak gently while wounding deeply, the way settlers spoke of peace while demanding distance. He recognized the loneliness inside Ethel the way he recognized tracks in soft dust, not by what was visible, but by what remained unspoken. Town chatter grew louder as men congratulated Samuel on his new courtship, and the attention he received made Ethel feel as though she had become a ghost slipping between lantern beams. She reached for a second pitcher to avoid standing idle, but her hand trembled. She set it down before anyone noticed. Nayati rose from his seat with slow certainty, as if pulled by an instinct older than pride. He crossed the hall with measured steps, the shadows bending around him, as though the lamplight understood where it belonged. He stopped beside Ethel without announcing himself, his presence both protective and unobtrusive. The room quieted briefly as eyes followed the shift, though no one dared speak. Nayati lowered his head toward Ethel, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. His breath carried the scent of cedar smoke and cold air. He whispered 4 words that felt heavier than anything she had expected from a stranger. "Act like you're mine now." The syllables did not sound like command or possession. They sounded like refuge, like a shield offered without condition. Ethel froze, stunned by the unexpected intimacy. She turned toward him, her eyes wide with confusion, but before she could form a question, Nayati extended his arm gently toward her hand. Ethel allowed him to guide her toward a nearby table, her heartbeat erratic, her mind racing without direction. Every pair of eyes followed them. The sheriff's, the pastor's, the town matron's, the children's and Samuel's. Whispers moved through the hall like wind through brittle grass. Samuel stiffened, discomfort replacing his earlier confidence, for it is one thing to reject tenderness and another to witness someone else honor it without hesitation. Nayati seated Ethel beside him with a steadiness that needed no explanation. He did not grip her hand, nor raise his voice, nor boast of gallantry. His posture alone discouraged unkind curiosity. He sat with Ethel, as if the table had always been prepared for both of them. Ethel felt the strange safety of being chosen without being claimed, seen without being displayed. Her loneliness thinned like frost before a quiet sun, though confusion pulsed beneath her calm exterior. Samuel approached them briefly, trying to mask irritation beneath a veneer of politeness. He asked if Ethel wished to rejoin the other guests. Nayati rested his hand loosely across Ethel's fingers, a gesture not dramatic but undeniably clear. Samuel faltered, unsure how to proceed, then stepped back with wounded pride. Ethel felt no triumph, only relief that the moment ended without ugliness. The hall resumed its songs and clinking dishes, but something had shifted. Nayati's presence anchored Ethel like a steady beam amid swirling winds. He ate quietly, offering no explanation for his earlier whisper, and Ethel did not ask for one. She sensed that gratitude would be enough for now. Across the tables, Samuel watched with a discomfort he could not disguise. The shopgirl beside him attempted another story, yet Samuel's attention kept drifting toward Ethel and Nayati. Ethel did not look his way again. Her heart did not swell with vengeance, only peace. As lanterns flickered above them and laughter regained its rhythm, Ethel realized something extraordinary. The worst moment of the evening had brought forth an unexpected kindness, one strong enough to alter the direction of her winter. And though she could not understand Nayati's motives, she sensed that his whisper had not merely protected her pride. It had awakened a story neither of them yet knew how to name. The hall emptied slowly after the final hymn, voices fading into the cold night like lantern flames carried along the wind. Ethel helped gather plates and stack cups while children tumbled sleepily toward wagon benches. The sheriff thanked everyone, and his wife dimmed the lamps until only a soft amber remained, flickering like thoughts no one had said aloud. Nayati waited near the entrance, his silhouette framed by the darkness outside. Ethel felt the strange awareness that he stood there not out of habit, but because something in him understood she would hesitate to leave alone. Samuel lingered near the hearth, gently wrapping the shopgirl's shawl around her shoulders before sending her outside with friends. His earlier pride seemed to have wilted under the weight of unspoken doubt. He cast one last look toward Ethel, hesitating as if regretting the easy comfort he once believed was his right. She met his glance without bitterness, simply acknowledging a parting of paths as final as winter harvest. Nayati stepped forward, offering Ethel her coat without touching her arms. She slipped it on, grateful for his consideration. Together they stepped into the cold, leaving behind the muffled echoes of the feast. Horses whickered near hitching posts, their breath rising like pale clouds beneath the starlit sky. The world outside felt larger than the room they had left, as if silence itself had been waiting for them. Samuel emerged a few moments later, boots scraping lightly against the gravel. He approached with the stiffness of a man who had practiced his words without fully believing them. He asked Ethel whether she truly meant to align herself with an Apache, his tone wrapped in concern but sharpened by wounded pride. Ethel answered that Nayati had treated her with dignity, when others treated her loneliness like a quiet inconvenience. Samuel opened his mouth to argue, yet Nayati stepped between them, not with hostility, but with the still strength of a man unwilling to be spoken through. Nayati's voice carried the calm weight of river stones. He told Samuel that Ethel was not a possession to be lost or won, and no one had stepped forward to shelter her until he did. Samuel protested that Ethel had never asked for protection. Nayati answered that the greatest kindness a man could offer was to see suffering without waiting for permission to care. Samuel's face flushed, recognizing the truth he had not considered. He apologized softly to Ethel, though the apology came too late to erase earlier wounds. She accepted with grace, and Samuel retreated toward the wagons, leaving a quiet lesson behind him. Ethel stood beside Nayati, her breath rising into the silver night. She thanked him for defending her without spectacle. Nayati looked up at the constellations cut cleanly across the sky, as if gathering the right words from a place older than conversation. He said he did not step between her and Samuel to prove strength, but to honor the tenderness she had guarded so carefully. Ethel felt emotion loosen inside her ribs like a knot surrendering. The town had scattered into the darkness, leaving only lantern shadows along the dusty street. Ethel and Nayati walked slowly toward the schoolhouse porch, the kind place where she often graded lessons after supper. The winter air smelled of juniper and distant fires, and a silence settled around them that felt almost sacred. Nayati paused near the porch steps, as if the earth beneath them wished to hold the moment steady. Ethel turned toward him, curious about the story behind his whisper. She asked why he had chosen that moment to speak those 4 words, though she still felt their mystery inside her like a soft storm. Nayati said he had watched her endure rejection with quiet dignity long before tonight, and he had witnessed the way she folded her sorrow instead of letting it spill. He told her he had noticed how the children followed her like wildflowers bending toward water, how widows leaned on her company when grief stole sleep, and how she mended her own gowns to save money for others. He saw strength inside her that did not beg to be admired. She had spent months believing that no one truly saw her, and he could not bear to watch her walk alone in a room full of people. Ethel's eyes shimmered, not from sadness but from the unexpected relief of being understood without explanation. She whispered that she had grown used to loneliness, like a coat worn threadbare. Nayati smiled softly and told her loneliness was not weakness. It was proof that she carried depth in a world that preferred noise over truth. He stepped closer, not closing the space with urgency, but with the reverence of a man who has learned to approach trust with patience. Ethel felt her heartbeat shift, not because she expected romance, but because his presence quieted every restless doubt that had lived inside her for months. Nayati said he did not claim her tonight. He only wished to stand where the world had failed to stand with her. He spoke without hesitation, telling her that love was not something a man took because he desired warmth. It was something offered when a heart recognized another heart carrying similar weight. Ethel felt her breath hitch. She asked him how long he had been watching her sorrow without speaking. Nayati said he had admired her since the first autumn, when she read stories beneath the cottonwoods for children who had been left by parents working long days on the ranch. He admired the steady way she stitched torn mittens at night, so each child could keep their hands warm through winter lessons. He admired the bravery she showed when she taught without complaint, even after storms flooded the schoolhouse roof. Somewhere along the way, admiration became affection, and affection became love without demanding reward. Ethel's knees weakened, not from shock, but from the tenderness wrapped around those words. She blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the thought that love had been growing quietly beside her, while she believed the world had stopped listening. Nayati reached for her hand, letting his palm rest gently against her fingers, a touch more comforting than any formal gesture could have been. He asked if she would allow him to walk beside her through the rest of winter, not as possession, but as companion. Ethel nodded slowly, letting emotion bloom like warmth rising from embers. She whispered that she had never imagined love could arrive without noise, without claim, without permission. Nayati told her that love sometimes arrives by seeing the heart others overlook. Ethel leaned her forehead lightly against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of a man who had never rushed her story. They stood beneath the stars as the wind carried the distant sound of a hymn fading into night. In that stillness Ethel understood something she had never understood before. The quietest love can be the strongest, and the gentlest man can rewrite a lifetime of loneliness with a single whisper that feels like belonging. And just as her heart settled into peace, Nayati lifted his head toward the road ahead, sensing movement from the darkness, as if winter still held one lesson more before morning. The church hall had emptied into the night, leaving only lantern shadows dancing against the windows and the faint perfume of pine garlands. Ethel stepped outside with Nayati, her breath meeting the cold air in pale clouds as horses stamped near the hitching posts. The silence between them felt neither awkward nor uncertain. It felt like a gentle bridge where words did not need to rush. Ethel touched the railing beside the schoolhouse porch, her fingers numb from the wind, yet her heart warmer than it had been in months. She could still feel the echo of Nayati's whisper at the feast, not as a claim, but as an act of sanctuary. Samuel emerged shortly after them, boots grinding against gravel, the confidence he held earlier now scattered like brittle straw. He approached Ethel with something resembling regret and told her he feared she had misread Nayati's intentions, as if protection must always hide a selfish motive. Ethel answered with a serenity Samuel had never seen from her, telling him that caution is sometimes the language of people who have only loved where admiration could be traded like coin. Samuel flinched at the truth wrapped inside her gentleness, offered a strained apology, and released the argument as if he finally understood he had stepped into a story whose depth he could not match. Nayati remained silent until Samuel disappeared beyond the lantern's halo. He lifted his gaze toward the shimmering constellations and told Ethel he did not step into her evening to claim her, but because sorrow should never stand alone in a room full of celebration. Ethel swallowed a soft ache and thanked him for shielding her without expecting gratitude. Nayati answered that when a heart endures wounds quietly, the world assumes it feels no pain, and kindness becomes the language only those with attentiveness can speak. They walked along the path leading to the edge of town, lantern light fading behind them as the night opened like a dark cathedral. The moon rested low on the horizon, silver and steady, brushing Ethel's hair with a faint glow. Nayati paused near an abandoned wagon torn by desert storms, a relic of lives long departed. Ethel leaned against the rail, sensing a weight in the air not born of fear, but of a truth waiting to step forward. Nayati told her that he had watched her soften the loneliness of orphan children without expecting praise, and how she stayed late after lessons to repair the mittens that mothers had no time to stitch. He said that love had approached him quietly, asking for patience rather than possession. Ethel's chest tightened as if her heart recognized itself for the first time. She asked when admiration became something deeper. Nayati released a breath that sounded like wind through cottonwood leaves. He confessed he had fallen in love with her long before tonight, not for her grace or her neat handwriting, but because he had never met a woman who believed gentleness could rebuild broken spirits without ever raising her voice. Ethel felt tears warm her eyelids, not because she had imagined romance, but because she had finally been seen by someone who valued her softness as strength. Nayati stepped closer, his face solemn beneath the moonlight, and told her that love does not ask for surrender. It asks for recognition. He asked whether she would allow him the privilege of walking beside her, when mornings felt heavy, when evenings felt hollow, and when winter nights curled inward like unanswered letters. Ethel trembled with an emotion too large to name, and whispered that she did not know how to trust a future she had never been offered. Nayati brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, telling her that trust does not require guarantees, only honesty and presence. Ethel rested her hands against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his skin. She said she feared love because it had often arrived dressed as disappointment. Nayati replied that disappointment is not love's fault. It is the fault of people who mistake affection for convenience. He lifted her face gently and told her that he would never ask her to shrink, to apologize for ambition, or to silence her hunger for purpose. He did not want to place her inside a life that diminished her. He wanted to stand beside a woman who carried goodness like a lantern. Ethel felt her heart finally exhale. Nayati held her close, the warmth of his arms shielding her from the wind, and she wondered if fate sometimes waits until a soul becomes strong enough to receive the love it prayed for in silence. She whispered that she would like him to remain through winter, through spring, through each uncertainty she once believed she must face alone. Nayati closed his eyes, overcome by relief. Suddenly, a distant cry shattered the stillness. Hoofbeats thundered from the ridge, wild and desperate. A rider galloped toward town, waving lantern light and shouting that coyotes had chased a child away from the cabins near the creek. Ethel and Nayati looked at one another, hearts leaping into motion. Nayati released her slowly, eyes burning with fierce purpose. Ethel felt fear rise, but beneath it lived a strange certainty. Love had arrived tonight, and it would now be tested by a night that demanded courage. Nayati told Ethel to stay near the lamps, and he mounted the nearest horse without hesitation, riding into the darkness like a streak of unbroken instinct. Ethel pressed her hands to her heart, praying for the child, and for the man who had stepped into danger without needing thanks. Lanterns flickered as neighbors gathered, and Samuel arrived breathless, asking Ethel if she trusted Nayati with her future. Ethel answered without pause. She trusted him with her present, and that was enough. And the night felt like a beginning, not a threat, for their shared journey.